Yeah, you're all shy. No predictions. Okay, let me pose the question. What do we do, firstly, if the budget gives us something? We welcome it with open arms and said, told you so? Or do we say, that's measly, we want more? Or sadly, it might be the budget gives us absolutely nothing, although we've got the meeting today. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
I'll go first, Jamie, if that's
Richard, yeah,
okay. Right, morning, everybody. I don't think it would do to be churlish here, but at the same time, I think we should recognise we've been banging on about the gaps in support for over a year now, and the progress that's been made has been pretty incremental. If there is any acknowledgement to the points that we've been making and any gaps are plugged, I think it would be churlish not to welcome them, but it provides the opportunity to say, but there is still this, all of these people are still missing out and whatever. So I think the point still needs to be made about the most obvious gaps there, the people who have missed out on furlough for whatever reason, people remunerated through dividends, all the rest of it, the gaps for the newly self-employed, all of these things. I think it doesn't necessarily change any of the arguments we've made, because I think he's not going to suddenly say you were right all along, but where he does change his mind, he usually changes it pretty decisively, but he doesn't go nearly far enough. So welcome any change that does come, but don't be shy about highlighting all the gaps that still remain, would be my thoughts on the matter.
That's good. Thanks, Richard. I take it that as and when we have the debate after the budget, all colleagues will put in to try and say something on it, depending on what we hear. Okay, anybody else like to come in? Margaret Ferrier, I see you on the chat. You agree important not to appear churlish. That's sound. Tracy, what's your thinking?
Yeah, I think Richard's pretty much on the right lines. Of course, we have spent the last year working with pressing Treasury to identify where we can get some quick wins, and then prise the door open so that then we can win for everyone. I think it has been a rocky road for so many of our groups, because you don't want to amplify one over another, and we won't as a group. I think the meeting with the Treasury is really positive. Obviously, they want to say they've met with us before the budget, but we will be feeding back from that meeting, and we will continue to press, because this is a historic injustice. And of course, the mood music is now that we're, the vaccinations have meant that we're coming out of this terrible period and people will have missed out. But look to the future, I think we really must still advocate for those who have been left with nothing. And as we know, that one member of a community might have had £27,000 in support from government, whilst just because of a dint of a tax code, someone will have had nothing. So we will be making the case, and I don't know if any other members of Parliament on this call are down to speak today in the debate around the budget and including the excluded. So I'll be making that case that this is not about just one group, it's about everybody that is taxpayers who deserve to be supported by the government, who've done everything right. So we don't know what their plan is. I do think that once the Chancellor decides something, he's not for turning. I do think that is quite frustrating, but we are working flat out to try and get some leverage so that we can make the case for absolutely everyone. It is a worrying time, I know, and so much has been, people are keeping everything crossed for March the 3rd. I can't hold out enormous hope for everyone, but I really do believe that we might get some concessions, and we will definitely be making the case this afternoon, that you can't abandon everyone. And then hopefully if we get them to support one group, we can then make the case that whilst it might be more complicated to support this group, we'll make a really powerful case for you and for them. So, rest assured, we're still fighting the good fight, and will continue.
Well done, thank you, Tracy. That puts it very succinctly indeed. And by the way, I should have pointed out, of course, this meeting is being live streamed, so everyone's watching social media, which is a good thing, because, we've got to bring the maximum pressure we can to bear on the government, the maximum powers of persuasion. I too am due to speak this afternoon in the debate, so absolutely we go for the same things as you're saying, Tracy. So hopefully we can all fit and mix, if you like. Anybody else before we move on in the agenda?
Come in, Jamie.
Emma.
Hi, morning everyone. Just to agree with what everyone said so far, I think it would be, if we get some concessions from the Chancellor, it would be churlish to knock them back and not say, okay, we're happy with that. But of course, you should always press for more because there are people who are in a desperate state and need that help. I think there's something else to consider here as well, is that obviously people will be aware that the government gave the additional restrictions grants to local authorities to do with as they wished. And we've come across a situation where my local authority is not given that to businesses. So we've got businesses who fell through the gaps who need that money, and that money is there and they're not getting it. So I think that's something else we need to be aware of, that if the government does decide to give that money down to local authorities to then dish out to those businesses who fell through the gaps, that we're also making sure that the local authorities do deliver and give that to those businesses in their patch.
Excellent. Thanks, Emma. Anyone else? No? Are we content? Okay, let's move on. We are very honoured today to have an excellent panel before us. We've got Denied Furlough, which is represented by Nicola Cromwell and Rachel Flower from Excluded UK. And we also have the director of the Central Think Tank, Mr. Torrin Wilkins. I propose, with your permission, that Torrin, you go first, and then we'll move on to Nicola and to Rachel. If that's okay by you, Torrin, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Jamie. So at the moment, the biggest issue with people who've been denied furlough is essentially that in order to get onto the furlough system, they are essentially reliant on their employer to furlough them. So at the moment, what you've had is that if you are self-employed and you're able to get on the system, you apply yourself to the Treasury, and that is up to them to then process your application. With employees, they have to go through one extra step, and that is their employer. Now, there are two main categories of people that have been excluded in this group: some whose employer wasn't able to keep them on, wasn't able to afford to keep them on, and others who were laid off. And we've had a lot of people who were laid off, be it for health and safety reasons, where they called out concerns within their companies. So there are lots of different categories within this one denied furlough group. And it has genuinely been quite difficult, actually, to look at the number of people who weren't just refused furlough, but were also then subsequently denied universal credit. So I've had so many people, when I was researching this, message me or, drop me an email and essentially say that they were struggling to put food on the table because they weren't even able to get the basic, government support after being denied from the furlough scheme. We estimated it was about 800,000 people who had been at maximum denied from this scheme. So it has been incredibly difficult to watch. And we've actually produced two solutions so far. The first one was in our paper on excluded to included, which I did with my co-author, Janie Little. We essentially looked at lots of groups, whether they were self-employed or whether they were employed. And one of those solutions was on people who were employed but were denied furlough. We then took that over, we expanded that plan into what has become the expanding furlough paper, which I wrote, and essentially looks at a new solution for people who have been refused from the furlough system. So the basic solution is an entrance route into the job retention scheme for people who have been denied furlough by their employer. So essentially what this uses is a national insurance number to check PAYE data, pay-as-you-earn data, through real-time information submissions. So what it essentially does is means that the government can check how much tax someone has paid, when they've paid it, how much money they're earning, and when they've left payroll. So it gives the government a lot of the information they need in order to actually come up with an estimate for individuals who've been denied furlough. So there is two parts to the scheme we've created. The first is backdated. So essentially we've looked from the beginning of the furlough scheme all the way to November, which is when the statistics we used in our paper came out in terms of people who were on payroll and off payroll. And essentially it would be a backdated grant to cover from when they left the payroll up until our figures go up to November. Of course, the government could be more generous on that if they wanted to. And the other, which is probably less likely to be used given the roadmap out of lockdown, is future payments for employees. which would essentially be a straightforward access scheme using national insurance in much the same way that self-employed people can access the self-employed side of things. It would allow employees to access if they were refused furlough by their employer and get straight onto the system. But as I said, that is the less likely of the two to be used, just simply because of the roadmap out of lockdown. It would most likely be one large backdated payment now. And so this plan would essentially include people who were refused furlough and also new starters who are on payroll. So it would include large numbers of people. And we did actually receive a Treasury response to this. It was fairly neutral. It essentially said that they'd done a fairly good job on the scheme so far, which in some ways I have to agree with. I mean, we looked in there at the German and French systems, which have been around for decades. The Treasury really had months to get this into practice, whereas other countries have had decades. So to be fair on their side, they essentially did push a scheme into practice very quickly. I think what we're asking for is a more worker-centric approach in terms of our paper and our solutions, is one that takes into account more that employees have been refused. So essentially at the moment we're looking at a new version of this plan to tailor it more to individuals, but we have essentially gone through, and the basic idea I think for a solution for these people is there.
Jamie, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was just saying thank you very much. Thank you for the time reminder, I was muted. Okay, I think without further ado, should we move on to our other two guests, Nicola and Rachel, and then we'll turn to questions after that. Is that okay? Rachel, Nicola, over to you. Rachel and Nicola, can you hear me?
Sorry, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Nicola, on you go.
Sorry, I'm here, having technical problems. First of all, thank you for letting me speak today. And Torin said an awful lot, really, of what we feel regarding the financial aspect of it. In February of last year, nobody believed really that this could be the last full paycheck that they would be receiving. When the furlough scheme was launched, the employer took all the decisions on whether it was to be implemented or not, and unfortunately thousands of employers decided that they were not going to furlough their employees. We've had many different sectors that have been affected by this, from the NHS to agency workers to airlines to just, it's across the board. It's across the board, whether it be childcare reasons, shielding, and generally just saying, no, we're not prepared to furlough. So these people have been left with absolutely no income whatsoever, overnight, pushed into poverty, and left with no alternatives. The benefit system is not fit for purpose in this state, to be perfectly honest. If you are still employed, if you leave, you are classed as making yourself intentionally employed, so therefore you have to wait 12 weeks for any benefits to kick in. If you haven't received a P45, you are doomed basically to receive any kind of JSA. If you were already on universal credit, it made life an awful lot easier for people because it would automatically give them the uplift on a monthly basis because the HMRC could see the loss of earnings. If you were shielding and told to shield by the government, you went down to SSP, which is £95 a week, and to go from a full-time wage to SSP is is difficult, to say the least. People that had childcare. There's a lady in Manchester, 3 primary school children, a single mum, who she'd worked for her employer for 16 years. Her children couldn't go to school. There was no childcare for them. And her employer said, no, I'm not furloughing you. You can just take unpaid parental leave. There's so many different angles to sort of take on this, but ultimately there is no recourse for the employee. We can't go to the employer and say that we've been treated unfairly, because they haven't done anything that the government haven't allowed them to do. The Treasury said that it was entirely up to the government for the employer to decide whether or not to furlough. All we are asking for is to be treated equally and fairly like everyone else. The people that were furloughed were allowed to take second jobs. They could have 2 wages coming into the house theoretically, and yet you have got people sitting at home with loss of income. So mortgage arrears, rent arrears, bills not being paid, food not being put on the table, having to turn to food banks. People that were earning £30,000, £40,000 a year having to go to food banks to make sure their children can eat. All we are asking for at denied furlough is the 8% backdated to March of last year, to at least make a dent in some of the debts that have been run up in this. People are facing homelessness, people are selling their houses. The stories I hear are horrific, through nobody's fault, apart from a system that hasn't been properly executed. And there has been a year nearly to get this right. And yet the furlough scheme still isn't fit for purpose. And going forward, it needs to be adjusted so that it is, and nobody ends up in this position again.
Nicola, thanks. That's good. Before I turn to Rachel, Cheryl Jones, you said you want to say something. Would you be happy to wait till after Rachel's spoken, or do you want to come in now?
No, that's fine, Jamie. I'll wait until a bit later. Thanks.
Rachel, would you like to add to what Nicola said? We're all agog for you.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. Rachel Flower from Excluded UK. Obviously, we represent all of the categories of the excluded, and really happy to have this meeting dedicated to denied furlough, because it's one of the categories that's incredibly unjust, but also doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And a lot of the time when people are talking about these exclusions, they tend to focus on the self-employed or even the limited company directors. Actually, from the survey information that we've taken from our community, it's also the case that in this category of workers is some of the most incredibly vulnerable, that a large amount of these workers were low income to start off with, and also a disproportionate effect on what you might call minority groups and also on women. So we're really talking about people who, look to their employers to look after them in the good times, and yet, as already mentioned, the fundamental flaw in the way this scheme was set up and then administered was that it was entirely up to the employer to act as a gatekeeper. At the point in time that the employer decides to deny furlough, then there is no right of redress to the employee. Although from the stories that we've heard and have tried to tell, that's not them for lack of trying. So many people finding themselves in this position have tried to go to places like ACAS or to the Citizens Advice Bureau to get support and help to bring a case against their employer. That there has been no legal right of redress available, particularly not with the courts closed for long periods. And we know that there's a long backlog of employment rights issues at this time. So the categories which have been mentioned, but they, for clarity, include 0 hours contract workers who could have been furloughed under the rights of the scheme, but many times were not. Certainly parents due to childcare arrangements, and we have a lot of situations in that category of shielding scenarios, and they're forced onto unpaid leave or parental leave. It's particularly pertinent for single parents. those who had to shield themselves and their employers didn't see that as a furlough right, and again pushed onto unpaid leave. We've seen a lot of public sector workers, things like bank nurses and supply teachers in this category, and also those in maternity and paternity rights where leave coincided with lockdown. Again, that was covered in a previous APPG meeting, and also redundancies. So as I'm very clear to say, no other sources of support were available for this particular category to turn to. So if we think about, the business loans, potentially the grants available through the council, when the Chancellor has made statements, as we all know, the narrative has been that everybody was entitled to some sort of help. We at Excluded UK have always been very careful to message that all we've asked for is parity of help, so that the things like mortgage holidays or debt deferrals shouldn't be placed in the same category as help as the income support schemes. But in the case of the denied furlough categories, a lot of those categories of help weren't even available to begin with. So we do know that a lot of these individuals have taken mortgage holidays, but they only lasted for 3 months or 6 months. Now almost a year on, as Nicola has said, so many fallen foul of eviction rules or had to sell their houses. The universal credit system has been a real problem for this category. Benefits often not an option. So if they were not in receipt of universal credit at the time, of course, they would then be refused because they might have a partner who worked, or they didn't have a P45. There needs to be a 12-week wait before an individual can class themselves as making themselves intentionally unemployed. So we immediately saw an example of the universal credit system not being fit for purpose even in normal times. And yet this is back to the adage of through no fault of their own, they couldn't even access that system. As time's gone on, of course, we've encouraged people affected by this category to try and get other jobs or other means of work. We know that it's not for want of trying, but of course, if those roles aren't available, then they've literally been pushed into unemployment in the meantime. And that has an intersection with the universal credit system as well, because if you move in and out of even temporary work, that affects whether you're eligible to make a claim, and has led to gaps for weeks or months at a time, where their universal credit claims are being put on hold or are being changed every time they manage to earn a little bit of money in the interim. So despite trying to do the right thing, that has fundamentally affected their ability to access living expenses, is what we're talking about, putting food on the table. These basic things that we say everyone should have been entitled to in the wake of the pandemic. Nobody should have been substantially worse off than they were at the beginning of the first lockdown. And again, the moral and ethical aspect of this, of people staying home to protect the NHS and save lives, but then not being adequately supported for their basic living expenses and having no right of redress against their employer in this very difficult situation. So we've also always called for parity of support. We've always called for backdated support. And as so eloquently being described, this is a category that could very easily be solved, because the PIYE records for employees can all be tracked back by HMRC. They can, even look at what job that person was doing at the time of the first lockdown. They can look at the correspondence from the employer denying the furlough, and a decision could have been made at that point and can now be made to give that backdated parity. This, in theory, would be an extension or a change to the CJRS scheme, so could be done as a simple extension to those rules. That's what we've been calling for many months, but equally could now be put in as some other form of grant, but using the HMRC records as the tool. And we would certainly say that this is a category where there is very little complexity and very little risk of fraud, because in the vast majority of cases, these people have been employed for many, many years and paid their taxes over the years. And so there's a number of benchmarks of information that HMRC could take and use as the means of extending that parity of support. I think, again, just in closing, we do see this as a category that's particularly vulnerable. And in the survey data that we've collated, people have faced a loss of income across the year, which is intolerable, and it will take years to recover their losses. And in many situations has already led to homelessness, severe debt, credit issues in the future, alongside this unbelievable emotional toll and impact on people's mental well-being of individuals and families, households forced into this situation. It affects children as well, of parents unable to work and not given support with their living expenses in the meantime. So we call for the backdated parity, and we say that the tools are available, but also we really want to be very clear, without that financial support being given in the budget or very shortly afterwards, this is the economic impact will be long lasting and catastrophic for so many, and has such a devastating impact on a divided society. And the fact that we have disparity literally in neighbourhoods. So in a row of terraced houses, you can have one person that was fairly treated by their employer and has been on furlough or on and off furlough, helped back to work in all this time. And then in the house next door, you've got someone who, just because of the way the system was set up, has been refused by their employer, has not been able to access any schemes, any ability to access things like mortgage holidays ran out a great deal of time ago, hasn't had fair access to the universal credit, and likely as not has been unable to find another job either suitable for their skill sets or just at all. We have people we know who've applied for scores of jobs or even hundreds of jobs in some situations. So we know that right across the board, and that's why Excluded UK is still calling out for this social injustice to be fixed. We know that people are really hard hit, but I would make a special plea for this category today, because we know that so many of these households and families were low income or medium income to start off with, and have just really suffered a terrible injustice at the hands of a system that could have been fixed, and with tools that could have been implemented some time ago, and would be really quite straightforward to do so now. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you very much indeed. You are very eloquent, as Nicola is too, and Torrin. I mean, I think every one of us knows that what you say is absolutely true. I can think of people in my hometown here in the Highlands who, are in such a different situation to their immediate neighbour. And as you say, the toll on mental health, what that does to marriages, what that does to relationships, what that does to parenting, is just absolutely terrible to think of. And your point about a divided society, which is exactly what we don't need just now, that surely has to get through the government. Enough from me. Gerald, you've been very patient. Gerald Jones.
Thanks, Jimmy. Obviously, the speakers have really illustrated the harsh reality, really, of the hell that so many people have been going through. And like all of us, you just mentioned it there, I've had people in my constituency that have been in this incredibly difficult situation where their employers have been denied furlough, not applied for furlough, and putting them in a really terrible situation. And it is one of the things I'm hoping to highlight this afternoon, because I'm down to speak in the debate as well. The question I wanted to ask before the speakers came in really was, with regards to the meeting with Treasury in advance of the budget, whether there is any inkling from Treasury as to how they sort of approaching that meeting, and any inkling of their sort of thinking. I guess not. But I just wanted to ask the question just in case there was anything that we're aware of in advance of that meeting with Treasury. Thank you.
Gerald, I stand to be corrected by colleagues, but I suppose in my own case, it's a case of we live in hope, but we're trying to put the arguments as persuasively as we can. And if we get the opportunity today, I'm sure we will, we'll try and point up what we've just heard today. Anybody else like to speak before we? Any other questions from our panelists? No. Okay. I think there'll be none. I think that's us. But I think unless our secretary tell me different, I think we've got the evidence. It's now a matter of record. It's been live streamed. People have seen what's been said, which is right and proper. I think that what we will do, and certainly in my own case, is reflect on what's been said today very deeply, and if I can, is try and bring it and other things out in the debate this afternoon. Because at the end of the day, we just have to, as MPs, we just have to be persistent and keep at it again and again and again, and hope that the message gets through. Anybody else before I conclude the meeting? I don't want to rush anyone. We've got a bit of time. available. Yep.
I suppose the only other point I would make, Jamie, is of course, if we're to expect an extension to the furlough scheme to be announced in the budget, then of course we're going to get whole new tranches of people becoming excluded for this particular category on the go forward as well. The same as if the self-employed grant is not extended for a fourth time, which that has been muted, I believe. We're continually trying to rectify the injustice for what's already happened, but new members are joining our community all the time saying that they now are affected through falling in the gaps. So we often talk about this as if it was a one time, and of course those people have been affected now for nearly a year, but actually this social injustice is continuing and will continue as we all try and recover and rebuild. And from the perspective of Excluded UK, this is obviously a real challenge for us as a volunteer-run not-for-profit organisation. We've all given a lot of time to this cause over the year, but questions need to be asked about how do we continue campaigning for justice. And I know that so many of the MPs and indeed influential figures such as the mayors have said that you will fight on for this cause, indefinitely. But I think it would be really helpful for us and to work with the APPG to say what would that look like in the wake of the budget. We can see that we're not going to get the support that is needed for everybody affected, and what are the levers open to us to continue trying to get this injustice fixed.
Yeah, Rachel, that's a very good point indeed. This is not a one-day one with this APPG, if I've got anything to do with it, and it's not, I know from talking to colleagues. So well made, good point. Alison, you'd like to come in.
Thanks very much, Chair. I just wanted to thank those that presented for what they've said today. I think that's incredibly helpful to have set that out so well. I would just like to add another group who've been missed out in furlough, and there's a group of both my constituents and people across Glasgow and the west of Scotland who were employed by some bars in Glasgow city centre, who ought to have been entitled to furlough, but the company involved has been up to something, and we're not quite clear what exactly they've been up to, but they haven't got the money that they should have been entitled to, because there's been something wrong with the way that the company has administered things as well. So there's a group of people who have missed out on the furlough that they ought to have got. They can't get universal credit either because they are supposed to be on the books of this company, so the DWP won't look at it. So I would just like to add that group of people who ought to have had their furlough haven't had their furlough because of the poor behaviour of their employers, and I would like to see some kind of recognition of that and what we put forward as well, because through no fault of their own either, they've lost out and lost out significantly on the pay they should have had.
Well said, Alison. Very good point indeed. Okie dokie, that's handy. And of course, none of us have an absolute grip of all the wisdom on this stuff. There'll always be things that we slightly missed at the edges. And as just been said, opportunities in the future when we can highlight something, when the government says something, we must always come back at it. Anybody else before I draw this meeting to a conclusion? I am in your hands entirely. No? Well, I think in that case, it falls to me to give a very sincere thanks on behalf of us all to our three panelists. It's worth remembering that MPs, we can talk away, but when we get the dialogue with people like our panelists, it's two-way, and our panelists are at the sharp end, if you know what I mean, and that's where that information and what is said to us is invaluable. These are real human life stories, and I think maybe it spurs us on. So my sincere thanks on behalf of us all to our panelists. Colleagues, thank you for taking your time and trouble. I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible this afternoon in the debate. It's just a pity, such a pity we can't make interventions virtually, but let's fight the good fight because it's worth it. Thank you very much indeed.